thank you very much, Lucy, for joining Ancient Origins for this discussion about what I think is a really fascinating topic, which is the origin of ancient cities and how that's connected to shamanism, which are two things you rarely hear together in one sentence. So it's very interesting. So just by way of introduction, you're the author of a book called Approaching Chaos, and you're also co-organising the upcoming Eternal Knowledge Festival, which hopefully you can tell us a little bit about at the end. So can we just start off with a brief overview about, what is your book about? What's the main theme of Approaching Chaos?
The main theme of Approaching Chaos is that as I investigated or read more about the ancient world, I became aware of the existence of a blueprint, an archetype for ancient civilization, and that this archetype did not arrive through a farming experiment. We've learned a myth, if you like, about the founding of cities, that it all comes about through markets and exchange of surplus produce, and it was all due to agriculture. But when I really examined the evidence from the past, that wasn't the case, and so I dug deeper, and I discovered, really by putting it together through extrapolation, like just looking at evidence, that it was more likely to have been the result of shamanic activity, that this blueprint was downloaded through an elite priesthood, and that this blueprint is still available to us today. That really is my message. That it's just about the ancients. It's about the ancients, what relevance they have to us in our daily life, which is why I run this event called Eternal Knowledge, because the knowledge is eternal. It's there for all time, and that's why I find the ancient thing really fascinating, because of its.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we think of the idea of shamanism, normally the first image that comes to mind is someone who's living in nature, in harmony with nature. You don't think of cities or, people who are involved in the foundation of cities.
Right.
Right. They seem to be two sort of contrasting things. So just going back to the beginning then, where you mentioned about the beginning with hunter-gatherers evolving, into farming, because the history books tell us that there's this natural evolution taking place.
Yeah.
So are you sort of saying that it wasn't a natural process, but it was some kind of intentional, planned process?
It's very hard to work out exactly who, but it would appear to me that they were different people. That they were not your hunter-gatherers suddenly having a light bulb go on and go, oh, wouldn't it be a good idea if? There are a number of reasons why I say that. And what you need to bear in mind, April, is that much of the evidence that I use comes from very well-established academic sources. I like to use conventionally mainstream material, because these people do an awful lot of solid work. The archaeologists and the prehistorians. So these are my sources. It's just that I give their work a different interpretation. I don't change the evidence itself. I just change the way you look at it. And what they talk about in mainstream is an event they call the secondary products revolution, which occurs around 5000 BC. And it's this moment where the prehistorians say that suddenly we could take milk from a cow, an auroch, a cow, a precursor to a cow, and make the secondary products of butter and cheese. We could take the coat off a sheep and make wool, because before that they didn't have wool, they had coats like deer. I mean, these are fundamental things that lots of people haven't picked up on, so this is the really key thing. And then what the prehistorians say is that because of these changes in animals, cities were able to come about. I say it's the other way around. I say it's because of cities that the changes in animals happen. That's the difference between me and them. But the evidence remains the same. This is really the fundamental point. The point about it, and that these cities were preformed. They were laid out. They were surveyed. They were not random marketplaces. And another fact that for me reaffirms my interpretation is that you might assume that if you were hunter-gatherers changing into city people, when it comes to changes in farming, what you would do would be to change the way you kept sheep and cattle, and that you would start herding them in a different way. And I have examined the evidence from Central Asia, where these days, for thousands of years, they've had these incredible movements of sheep and cattle in Central Asia, up and up the mountains in the summer and down into the valleys for the winter. And so you would think that would be an ideal place where you would find Bronze Age evidence of this change. But no, what you find time and time again is that where Bronze Age farming occurs, it's the pig that is the sign of Bronze Age farming. And the pig indicates a settled pattern of farming. It doesn't get herded over long distances. The cattle and sheep come into the picture later. So that in its sense also confirms to me that these were different people who are actually carrying out these activities. They weren't your hunter-gatherers saying, "Oh, let's just change the way we do things." So a lot of suspicions arise. And for example, Jacquetta Hawkes, who's a very well-known author on these matters, she talks about the evidence of early cities being priests who start them, not farmers. The first sign of a city is some sort of ritual, some sort of shrine. And so there's so many different things you can point to that just go, that does not confirm the conventional view of these things.
Right. So when you say different people, are we talking about different races of people here or different groups of the same race?
That's what's really, really hard to work out. I mean, then you're really getting massively into the realm of speculation. For instance, it's possible that the long-headed, long-skulled people had something to do with all of this. There's a very curious piece of evidence that I've come across, because one of the things that I also look at is the origins of what we call the Indo-European tribes, who are your ancestors and my ancestors, the people that started off with Latin and Greek and Celts and Germans and these people. And there's a lot of controversy about the original homeland for the Indo-Europeans. And one of the things that I came to the conclusion was that they came from, curiously enough, the Ukraine, where there's a lot of political turmoil at the moment, and north of the northern area of the Black Sea, the Pontic Caspian. There's many reasons why I've come to that conclusion. But one of the strangest things about that is I've also discovered that there's a Swiss firm that carries out DNA profiling who've established that Tutankhamun has an ancestor that comes from that area.
I recently read about that.
Yes. How strange is that? And my reason for saying that, my reason for bringing that piece of information into the picture, is that I don't think it was these people like the Indo-Europeans who did things like domesticate the horse. Even though the horse, the early tarpan, the precursor of the horse, it comes from that part of the Ukraine, comes from the steppes, comes from the Pontic Caspian. I think it's because the civilizers, the city people, went to where these original herds existed and then domesticated them in situ and left behind a legacy of possibly genetic material and many other things which to me confirm that they indicate that they were present. I mean, words in our language, techniques they left behind. They left behind knowledge of the secondary products revolution, for example. That comes because language reveals so much. Etymology it cannot lie. It reveals so much. So that's one reason why I think these things are very suspicious. And
yes.
The blue-eyed gene, for example, where does that come from? That as a professor I think it's a Danish professor in Copenhagen who's done work on the blue-eyed gene, and again from the Black Sea area. These things do seem to point to the same sort of thing going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now you mentioned before about priests, being involved in the first cities, or them having shrines. So can you explain a bit about what these first cities were like? How were they set up? How were they structured? What was life like in those ancient cities?
Well, the thing that seems to me to make a distinction between a city and a settlement, because you have very ancient settlements like Çatalhöyük and Göbekli Tepe, in southern Turkey. I mean, you've no doubt had people on your program talking about Göbekli Tepe, and they are very ancient. There's no doubt about it. But these are fundamentally different in many ways. What distinguishes a city from those much earlier settlements? One is the fact that the cities are laid out in a very precise format. They're often based on a quartering. In fact, I discovered 3 fundamental patterns which seem to occur throughout the Bronze Age. One is quartering. One is a grid-like pattern, the sort of thing that New York is laid out in. Cities like Akhenaten, the city of Akhenaten, was laid out on that pattern. And a circular pattern, Byblos, for example, and even ancient Atlantis was a circular pattern with a temple in the middle. And so they're very definitely surveyed, they're very definitely set out. That is a very fundamental difference between those cities and others. They had a very definite attitude towards water storage, water use, drainage, sewage, bringing in fresh water. They're very, very structured in that sense. When it comes to the Indus Valley, where this type of civilization appears, references to the sewage system being there as unparalleled in pre-classical times because it was so carefully done. All houses had outlets for sewage and so forth. And they also had administrative activities, judiciary activities. They were in many respects familiar. They would be familiar to us as cities and places where different trades took place. And for example, by 2800, those Mesopotamian cities, 80% of people lived in them and had wheeled carts and horses. So things were set up very much, in the early days. So the extraordinary thing is that these changes that occurred in domestication of animals and so forth didn't really alter. That was it. That was farming done forever, really, until almost modern times. Everything would be recognizable in terms of those ancient places. I mean, that's the extraordinary fact. The
other extraordinary thing about it is how suddenly all of that seemed to come about. That apparently there were, tribes hunting and gathering in the forests, then, a bit of farming here and there, and then suddenly you've got legal systems, you've got religion, you've got administration, record keeping, writing, just, very, very suddenly. Where did that come from?
Exactly. I mean, another writer in the conventional historical stuff, he talks about the administration levels of ancient Mesopotamia being no different from modern times. They were as bureaucratic as we are now, and that's 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. I mean, just remarkable. And as you say, it seems to happen not quite overnight. I mean, the one that happens overnight is Egypt, when Egyptian society seems to appear from nowhere, but by that time Mesopotamia had already been in existence, and there are plenty of people who subscribe to the view that it was Mesopotamians who re-entered Egypt. David Roll, the historian, he's definitely of the view that they came in through the Eastern Desert. So that's not totally surprising, because you can see where that could have happened from. But where the Mesopotamians came from, and the Sumerians, very hard to say. I really don't know what the answer is to that.
So is your perspective that at the centre of all these cities was someone who had the role of a shaman, or someone who had a religious or spiritual function, who was like the foundation of those ancient cities?
The way I look at it is, in my talks I use a colour wheel, and I divide this colour wheel up into 8, and I use white as the extra colour from the rainbow colours, because I see cities very much as being all of a piece. Everything in the package you need for the whole thing. So that includes, and there are interesting relationships across this circle. So you have agriculture, horses, domestication, cattle on one end, and arable. So that's red and blue opposite to each other. Everything to do with communication. So you have trade, you have education. That's another one. And that lines up, I think it's yellow and purple, that one. And then you have fresh food, cuisine, and medicine, green and white. They line up in this colour circle. And then a really fascinating one is the cross thing, which is government and priesthood. They are orange and indigo. They line up. And so it's a relationship. It's a dynamic relationship. So it's not really hierarchical in that sense of there being a top-down king. This is very much our way of looking at it. I talk about the divine right as in R-I-T-E as opposed to R-I-G-H-T. So I see that the king or the pharaoh is taking on service on behalf of his people, and that he works with the priesthood to bring these things about. And indeed, the very word pharaoh, I think, is based on the words, a Greek corruption of the words per meaning house, household, and ur meaning foundation. And this, the the foundation, house of foundation, is where the ruler of Egypt went to be initiated. So I think that's why we know as much as we do about Egypt is through the Greeks, and it's through their interpretations of things. So I think even that very title is an indicator of what was going on. So there was, as it were, one key person who took it upon themselves to be the possible sacrificial person, because to do the shamanic thing, to do the whole shamanic rite, and what happened with the pharaoh was that he trained for a one-off event in his life called the Hebsed festival. They call it a jubilee because it only happens every 40 years. And every single pharaoh tried to have a Hebsed festival and to build his own pyramid for a Hebsed festival rites, which is also an interesting phenomenon. And part of that, in the secret part of that, he experienced the Osirian rites, which involved being buried alive for 3 days. And he could literally be, as they say in the text, be embraced by Osiris and not return. He could literally die, and it was dangerous. And during this time, he was astral planing. He was out of body. He was journeying in order to bring back the blueprint, in order to reconfirm civilization. That was the purpose of said festival. So
what is that blueprint? It's bringing back information that was needed for the civilization
to continue or to start. So, for example, it became apparent to me that there was a massive catastrophe at around 3100 BC, one which triggered the migration, one which split the Indo-Europeans up and sent them in all directions, and one which brought the Mesopotamians out of Mesopotamia and into Egypt and eventually into the Indus Valley and spread the whole Bronze Age city thing around. And so they didn't have computers, they didn't have vast records, they didn't have huge libraries, they didn't have any of these things. What they had were their techniques, so they knew how to access the archetype. So that meant that when Egypt needed to restart again, they knew what to do. And there were other times when there were intermediate periods. And the thing that people don't comment on is how consistent Egypt is over nearly 4,000 years. You know, it's just remarkable. You look at stuff that's the very oldest, and you look at stuff that's the most recent, and you can't really see a huge amount of difference. It doesn't vary. I mean, that is in itself an incredible thing. And I think it's because they knew how to continually access the same archetype. That's my personal view of it.
Right. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting perspective. Now, you mentioned about that the pharaoh prepared for this festival, and that, you know, he would actually go through an out-of-body experience to access this blueprint. Is there anything in the archaeological record which sort of supports this view?
Well, there are
texts.
Yes, there are the texts. There are they're called that we mistakenly refer to them as the Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts. I mean, the difficulty is that our view of so much of the ancient past is coloured by our own cultural ignorance, our own cultural misinterpretations of things. So that, you know, this whole business of pyramids being tombs and all of that, because we don't kind of like understand this out of body thing. And so when William Flinders Petrie, the 19th century archaeologist, the Victorian archaeologist, was discovering these things and discovering the texts at, say, for example, at Saqqara, he assumes that because they talk about the journey of the pharaoh's soul, that they're talking about him being dead. But this is because we hadn't the cultural tools to analyze that and interpret it as him being alive. This is the difference, because we didn't understand about shamanic stuff at that point, and we still don't really. I mean, this is the big difference. So these texts do give a lot of indication as to what the techniques were and what happened, and we know pretty much that in the Hebsed festival there were big public events. There were Saqqara, you can see it fairly clearly. There's a big festival court there, and everyone would come from all over Egypt to bear witness. And the pharaoh wore a special bull kilt, and he ran around this court to show his virility or whatever. He also participated in a special meal called the Hetep meal. And it's possible during this meal that he consumed something called the solar bread. And it's my speculation that it's at that point he consumes possibly the powdered gold that helps him with his out-of-body stuff later.
So like a mind-altering type substance.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. And it's fairly well established that the Egyptians were well aware of the mind-altering properties of the Nile blue lotus and Minoans, for example, knew about opium poppies, and opium poppies I think have been found in places in Egypt too. So the mind-altering aspects of things, these were well known. And then after he's consumed this meal, he disappears inside the pyramid into what's called into the realm of Sokar, who's a deity along with Osiris and Ptah. And when he's in the realm of Sokar isn't to do with death, but it is to do with sort of reanimation, and it's to do with cycles of life and death. So it's about his. This is why it can be referred to as a shamanic experience, because the pharaoh dies to be born again, in a sense, and he puts on something called the Keni garment over his chest, and I think that's to protect his heart from electrical field, because I think he's going to be exposed to a big electrical field as well. And he participates in something called the Wepwet opening of the mouth ceremony, where he has his adze put in his mouth. Now, I think that's to stop. I personally think that's possibly to stop him swallowing his tongue while in trance. That's just a personal view. And then he either lays on a special bed, a Hebsed festival bed, which could be gold-plated, or he lies in a sarcophagus of alabaster or granite, as in the Great Pyramid, where there's the granite thing. And there he stays for 3 days in the realm of Sokar, doing what he does. I think these are. I don't think any of that is controversial. I think that is all fairly well established, especially things like the Hebsed festival bed. You could see Tutankhamun's special bed in the Cairo Museum before. You know, I don't know if it's still there now, but you could. And so that's really what happens to him, and then obviously he gets the download, and life carries on, and so I mean I'm only really joining up the dots.
Yeah.
I've not really kind of making it up, or no.
Yeah, and when do you think this process actually sort of stopped? I mean, when do you think all this was lost? This tradition.
Well, I think that something seems to have happened from when the sort of shift from Bronze Age to Iron Age happens. I think the date that is around 1200 BC, but I could be wrong about that specific date. I wouldn't want to be tied to the date, because it's not the date that really matters, it's the events that follow. I tie it into the fall of Troy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what occurred was that the Indo-European tribes, after they'd left the Ukraine, they went in different directions. And the Greek and Latin-speaking varieties of them went down through the Caucasus, and I think they ended up somewhere in Turkey at some point. There's lots of different reasons for thinking that. And it's also possible that they may, especially the Greek ones, may have been used as mercenaries by the Egyptians. And it's almost like Sorcerer's Apprentice, if you're familiar with that story, where the sorcerer leaves the apprentice to on his own, and the sorcerer decides to have a go, and the experiment gets out of control when the sorcerer comes back. That these tribes became more powerful than they were meant to become, as it were, and they become a threat to Egypt, because it's very interesting that Egypt starts to decline from about that point onwards. The first people to invade are an Indo-European tribe of the Persians, the Iranians, in about 600 BC. And then there's Alexander the Great in 333 BC. Now, he's different because he loves Egypt. He thinks Egypt is just amazing. And so he's unusual in a conqueror, and he wants more. He wants everything. He wants to sponsor a library. He wants to collate all the knowledge from all over the world, the known world. But even so, it's still a contributing factor to the decline of Egypt. And so before that point, now this is a really critical thing, before that point, at about 600 BC, the Egyptians know they are in trouble. They know that things are not going well. The writing is on the wall, kind of almost literally. In the Hermetica, which is the amazing texts of the ancient Egyptians, there's a very sad prophecy in it where they say, only stones will survive to tell your stories, your children will not be recognized, only your language will remain, everything else will go. Egypt as temple of the world will be destroyed. And I think that what happened then was there was a bit of conflict within Egypt. What do we do? Some of them, because these techniques needed to remain very secret because they're very powerful techniques, this whole out-of-body thing, the whole shamanic thing. They did not want it falling into the wrong hands. But they were also very well aware that their knowledge of other things was going to disappear if they weren't careful. So I think it's very significant that around 600 BC, suddenly the Greeks know everything. If you think about it, we're always being told, oh, this thing to do with mathematics, it starts with the Greeks. Oh, this thing to do with medicine, it starts with the Greeks. Whatever you study, people always say, it starts with the Greeks. Well, where do they think they got it from? You know? I mean, even Pythagoras, even he says, I spent 25 years in Egyptian temples learning what I learned. And people go, no, there's nothing Pythagorean about Egyptians. And you Pythagorean calculation, as it were, in the Great Pyramid. I mean, this is the thing. Because the Egyptians, they mostly learnt what they knew through memory. The art of memory was really important. They didn't necessarily write it all down. So they obviously decided, and there was a Greek trading point up on the Nile Delta around 600 BC. They obviously decided that they would take a risk. They would take a chance on these Greeks, and they would open up. And Pythagoras, his I think it was his father who was a trader or whatever, who obviously came into contact with the Egyptians. And so that for me just explains so much. And then after that, Egypt becomes gradually weaker and weaker, and because they're not really a militaristic society, a lot of the images I think that you find in Egypt today are the later Greek Ptolemaic pharaohs. I don't necessarily think they relate to the older stuff, which I don't think exists anymore. And they didn't want it to fall into the hands of the Romans. That was the main thing. They had to be, and they succeeded until Cleopatra and Antony around 30 BC, and then after that it's game over. And the final priests of the great temple of Isis at Philae are all slaughtered in the 4th century AD, and after that no one can read hieroglyphs, and it's the end. It's over completely. So it's a long, slow decline, but a decline nonetheless.
Well, it's a really fascinating theory, I think, that you've put forward, because it really does, as you said, it joins the dots. I mean, there are so many unanswered questions about, how these great civilizations appeared and where all the knowledge came from. So it really, it really provides a lot of answers to some of those questions. So
it does shed some light. It kind of makes sense of certain things. That's the thing.
Does, yeah.
Because you can look at what they're doing in the. I got my information. I extrapolated some of it from people like Jeremy Narby and his Cosmic Serpent material on the Amazon. People like him. He was really useful. Dr. Jeremy Nadler, who's an Oxford academic, he analysed the texts in Egypt, the pyramid texts, and he describes them as a shamanic text. He's very unusual. He's one of the few. You can buy his book. It's a very good book. So I'm really just using material that's out there to say, hang on, this is kind of like, it's obvious when you look at it.
Yeah. Well, it might be out there in bits and pieces, but you don't really hear it all pulled together into one.
That's very true.
Narrative. So before we finish up, could you explain a little bit about the upcoming Eternal Knowledge Festival that you're involved with?
Yes, well, Eternal Knowledge has really kind of grown out of my interest in all of this. And also he used to have a lovely man in Suffolk called Sir John Agnew, who ran something called Stars and Stones, and he sadly passed over a year or so ago. Well, no, 2 years ago now. And so we wanted to do it in memory of him as well, because he's very good at gathering people. Because we need places to meet. We need to be able to see each other face to face and exchange ideas, because too much happens on the internet. Lovely as it is, it's not the same as meeting someone in the flesh.
Yes.
And so we take we have a very broad remit, and really what we're following is the Hermetica, this body of knowledge, of wisdoms really, that's been around for thousands of years. But we do incorporate South America and all the amazing stuff there. So we've had Brian Foster came first time. We ran this event under canvas in a field here on the farm in Suffolk 2 years ago. Disastrous weather, but everybody was amazing. It was an incredible experience. And so Brian came over from Peru. That was fantastic. And hopefully we're going to connect again with him by Skype. So that's pretty brilliant. We've got people like Adrian Gilbert, who co-authored with Robert Baval the Orion Mysteries book, and many other really interesting books. And so we sort of follow it from the Bronze Age all the way through. This time we've got stuff on the 17th century, Rosicrucianism. We've got Exeter University academic who's going to talk about that. We've got a medieval historian coming from Oxford who's going to talk about Cathars and heresies and things. We've got a man who's going to do a workshop on sacred geometry, Tom Bree, who teaches at the Prince of Wales School on Architecture. We've got the lovely Patricia Arwen coming from Egypt, which will be very exciting. She's going to do a workshop on Egyptian spirituality. So there's probably lots I've missed. Oh, Gregory Sams. He's no event is complete without Gregory Sams. He's just wonderful. He talked about the influence of the sun last time on religion, and this time he's going to talk about ancient city-states and how that relates to modern politics. It's going to bring very much up to date. He's just published a book, Status Out of Date. So that he's going to be talking. So yes, I mean, it should be. Gary's going to do his thing on Egypt and sound and everything. So it will be a fascinating weekend. It's at the beginning of July.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Lucy. It was really interesting hearing from you and hearing that perspective, and good luck with the festival. I hope it goes really well, and hear from you again.
Yes, indeed. No, look forward to talking to you again. I'm glad that was good. Excellent. Time, April.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See?